You really think you can handle all this by yourself? Trevor asked, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured at the stack of property documents spread across my kitchen table. These rental properties require serious management skills, Ruth. Maybe you should let someone with actual business experience take the lead. I looked up from the paperwork, my jaw clenched tight. It had been exactly 4 days since I'd inherited 5 rental properties from my late Aunt Beverly in Phoenix, Arizona, and somehow my ex-husband had already found out about my windfall. The audacity of this man never ceased to amaze me. My name is Ruth Patterson. I'm 47 years old, and I work as a dental hygienist here in Tucson. For the past 3 years since our divorce, I'd managed to build a quiet, stable life for myself. I had my small apartment, my reliable job at Dr. Henderson's practice, and most importantly, my freedom from Trevor's constant need to control every aspect of my existence. But now, standing in my kitchen with his slicked back hair and that familiar smirk, he was trying to worm his way back into my life through my inheritance. I didn't ask for your help, Trevor, I said firmly, gathering the documents closer to me. And I certainly don't need your business expertise. He laughed, the same patronizing sound that had grated on my nerves for 15 years of marriage. Come on, Ruth, you're a dental hygienist. What do you know about property management, tenant relations, or real estate law? These properties are worth over $800,000 combined. You could lose everything if you don't handle this properly. The number made my stomach flutter with both excitement and anxiety. $800,000. My Aunt Beverly had been more generous than I'd ever imagined. We hadn't been particularly close. She was my father's sister, a successful real estate investor who'd never married and had no children. When her lawyer called to tell me I was the sole beneficiary of her property portfolio, I'd been stunned. I'm perfectly capable of learning what I need to know, I replied, but Trevor was already shaking his head. Learning on the job with that kind of money at stake? That's not smart, Ruth. Look, I know we have our history, but I've been managing commercial properties for Kellerman Associates for over a decade now. I could help you maximize these investments, maybe even expand the portfolio. There it was, the hook. Trevor worked as a property manager for a mid-sized real estate firm, and his eyes had lit up with dollar signs the moment he'd heard about my inheritance. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head, calculating how he could insert himself into this situation and somehow benefit from my good fortune. Something cold settled in my chest as I watched him lean against my counter like he belonged there. This wasn't about helping me. This was about control, just like everything else had been during our marriage. The memories came flooding back as I stared at Trevor's expectant face. 15 years of marriage where every decision had to go through him first. When I'd wanted to go back to school to become a dental hygienist, he'd insisted it was impractical. When I'd saved up money from my part-time retail job to buy a small car, he'd convinced me to put it toward our future instead, which meant his business ventures that never quite panned out. The worst part was how he'd made it seem reasonable, even caring. "I'm just looking out for us," he'd say. "I have more experience with these things." Or my personal favorite, "Trust me, honey. When have I ever steered you wrong?" Well, he'd steered me wrong plenty of times, like when he'd persuaded me to co-sign on his failed restaurant investment, leaving us $30,000 in debt, or when he'd used our joint savings to buy into a pyramid scheme that promised to make us rich. Each time it was my fault for not being supportive enough when his grand plans collapsed. The divorce 3 years ago had been brutal. Trevor had fought me on every single asset, claiming that since he'd been the primary breadwinner during most of our marriage, he deserved the larger share. Never mind that I'd worked multiple jobs to keep us afloat while he chased one get-rich-quick scheme after another. In the end, I'd walked away with just enough to rent my small apartment and start over. But starting over had been the best thing that ever happened to me. For the first time in decades, I could make decisions without someone questioning my judgment or undermining my confidence. I'd thrown myself into my work at the dental practice, building relationships with patients, and earning Dr. Henderson's trust. I'd even started taking evening classes in business management, something I'd always wanted to do, but never had the courage to attempt while married to Trevor. "You're being awfully quiet," Trevor said, snapping me back to the present. "I hope you're not seriously considering trying to manage these properties alone. The Phoenix rental market is competitive, Ruth. One mistake could cost you thousands." I studied his face, noting the way his eyes kept darting to the property documents. He was hungry for this opportunity, practically salivating at the chance to get his hands on my inheritance. But there was something else in his expression, a familiar calculation that I recognized from our marriage. He wasn't just offering to help. He was positioning himself to take over. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked carefully. Trevor's face brightened, clearly mistaking my question for interest. "Well, I was thinking we could form a partnership. I'd handle the day-to-day management, collecting rent, coordinating repairs, dealing with tenant issues, and you could remain the owner. We'd split the management fees, say 60-40 in my favor since I'd be doing most of the work." 60-40 in his favor. Of course. The man hadn't changed a bit. "And what makes you think I'd want to go into business with my ex-husband?" I asked. His smile faltered slightly. "Because you need help, Ruth. And because despite everything that happened between us, I still care about your financial security." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that for a moment, I almost believed he meant it. "I need some time to think about it," I said finally, knowing that would buy me the space I needed to figure out my next move. Trevor's face lit up with triumph, clearly interpreting my response as a victory. "Of course, take all the time you need, but don't wait too long. The rental market moves fast, and these properties need active management. I'd hate to see you lose money while you're deliberating." After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the inheritance documents and feeling a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. The rational part of my brain knew Trevor was wrong. I was perfectly capable of managing these properties myself. But the voice that had been conditioned by 15 years of his constant undermining whispered that maybe he was right. Maybe I was in over my head. That evening I called my friend Janet, a paralegal who'd helped me navigate the divorce proceedings. "Janet, I need some advice about protecting assets," I said without preamble. "Ruth, what's going on? You sound stressed." I explained the situation with the inheritance and Trevor's sudden appearance in my life. Janet listened without interrupting, but I could hear her sharp intake of breath when I mentioned his partnership proposal. "Ruth, you cannot let that man anywhere near your inheritance," she said firmly. "I've seen this pattern before. He's going to find a way to claim ownership or control, and you'll end up losing everything you've worked for." "But what if he's right? What if I can't handle this alone?" "Listen to me," Janet said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used in court. "You've been managing your own life just fine for 3 years. You've built a career, maintained your independence, and made smart financial decisions. Don't let him gaslight you into thinking you're incompetent." Her words hit me like a slap of cold water. Gaslighting. That's exactly what this was. The same pattern of manipulation that had defined our marriage. Trevor wasn't offering to help. He was positioning himself to swoop in and take control of my newfound wealth. "What should I do?" I asked. "First, you're going to set up a trust to protect these properties. Second, you're going to establish an LLC for property management. Third, you're going to document every interaction you have with Trevor from now on. And fourth, if he keeps pushing this partnership idea, you're going to shut it down hard." I felt a spark of something I hadn't experienced in years, not just determination, but actual excitement. This inheritance wasn't just money. It was an opportunity to prove to myself and everyone else that I was capable of far more than anyone had ever given me credit for. "Janet," I said, a smile creeping into my voice, "I think I'm ready to show Trevor exactly what this dental hygienist can accomplish." The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since the day my divorce was finalized. It was time to take control. The next Monday, I took a personal day from the dental practice and drove to Phoenix to see my inherited properties for the first time. Janet had recommended a lawyer who specialized in estate planning and asset protection, and I had an appointment scheduled for the afternoon. But first, I wanted to see what I was really dealing with. The properties were spread across 3 neighborhoods, all in decent areas with good rental potential. As I walked through each unit, a duplex in Scottsdale, 2 single-family homes in Tempe, and a small apartment building with 4 units in central Phoenix, I felt a growing sense of pride and possibility. Aunt Beverly had been smart with her investments. These weren't run-down properties that needed major work. They were well-maintained rentals in stable neighborhoods. At the apartment building, I met Mrs. Rodriguez, a tenant who'd been living there for 6 years. "Your aunt was a wonderful landlady," she told me as we chatted in the courtyard. "Always fair, always responsive when something needed fixing. I hope you'll be the same way." "I plan to be," I assured her, and I meant it. This wasn't just about the money. It was about providing good homes for people and building something meaningful. My appointment with the lawyer, Howard Brennan, went better than I'd hoped. He was a sharp-eyed man in his 60s who listened carefully as I explained my situation with Trevor. "You're smart to be proactive about this," he said, pulling out a legal pad to take notes. "What you need is a revocable living trust that will hold all the properties, plus a limited liability company to handle the management side. That creates multiple layers of protection. How long will that take to set up?" "If you're serious about moving quickly, I can have the paperwork ready by Friday. The trust will name you as the sole trustee and beneficiary, and the LLC will be structured so that only you have signatory authority. Even if someone tried to claim ownership or control, they'd have no legal standing." I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. "And if my ex-husband tries to insert himself into the business?" Howard's smile was grim. "Unless you voluntarily add him to the trust or the LLC, he has absolutely no rights to these properties or any income they generate. In fact, if he attempts to interfere with your business operations or makes fraudulent claims about ownership, you'd have grounds for a harassment lawsuit." When I got home that evening, there was a voicemail from Trevor. "Ruth, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I have some ideas for maximizing the rental income. I'd like to come by tomorrow evening to go over some proposals. I think you'll be impressed with what I've put together." The presumption in his tone made my blood boil. He was already acting like we were partners, like my inheritance was partly his to manage. I deleted the message without calling him back. The next morning at work, I found myself humming as I cleaned patients' teeth. Dr. Henderson noticed my good mood during our coffee break. "You seem particularly cheerful today, Ruth. Good news?" I'd always liked Dr. Henderson. He was a fair employer who respected his staff and never made anyone feel inferior. "I inherited some rental properties from my aunt," I told him. "I'm setting up a business to manage them." His eyebrows rose with interest. "That's wonderful. Real estate can be very rewarding if you approach it thoughtfully. My daughter manages some commercial properties downtown. She always says the key is having good systems and treating tenants fairly." "That's exactly what I'm planning to do," I said, feeling another surge of confidence. When I got home that evening, Trevor was waiting in my building's parking lot, leaning against his car with a thick folder in his hands. My heart sank. I'd hoped to avoid this conversation until after I had all my legal protections in place. "There you are," he called out as I parked. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." "What are you doing here, Trevor?" I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. He held up the folder. "I told you I had some proposals to share. I've put together a complete business plan for your properties, market analysis, rental rate optimization, maintenance scheduling, the works. This is professional level work, Ruth. The kind of thing my firm charges thousands for." I reluctantly let Trevor follow me up to my apartment, telling myself I needed to hear what he was proposing so I could prepare my defenses. He spread his documents across my coffee table with the enthusiasm of a salesman closing a big deal. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a spreadsheet. Your current rental rates are at least 15% below market value. With proper management, you could increase your monthly income from $4,800 to over $5,500. I had to admit, the numbers looked impressive. Trevor had clearly done his homework, researching comparable properties and analyzing market trends. But as I studied the documents more closely, I noticed something troubling. These projections assume significant rent increases, I said. Some of my tenants have been in their units for years. I can't just jack up their rent because the market will bear it. Trevor's expression showed a flash of impatience. Ruth, this is business, not charity. If you're not maximizing your return on investment, you're essentially losing money. Good tenants will adapt to reasonable increases, and the ones who can't afford market rates, well, that's what turnover is for. The callousness in his tone reminded me why I'd grown to dislike him so much during our marriage. Everything was about profit margins and bottom lines, never about the human cost of his decisions. And here's the management structure I'm proposing, he continued, flipping to another document. I'll establish Ruth Patterson Property Management as a subsidiary of my current firm. You'll be listed as the primary owner, but I'll have full operational authority. It's the most efficient way to handle the day-to-day operations. I stared at the organizational chart he'd drawn up. Ruth Patterson Property Management. He'd already named our supposed partnership after his company and included himself as the general manager with authority over all major decisions. Full operational authority, I repeated slowly. What does that mean exactly? Lease agreements, tenant selection, maintenance contracts, rent collection, all the decisions that require quick action and industry expertise. You'd retain ownership and receive your share of the profits, but the actual management would be my responsibility. I felt my anger building, but I kept my voice level. And what's my role in this arrangement? Trevor leaned back with a satisfied smile. You get to enjoy the income without the headaches. Think of it as being a silent partner. You provide the assets, I provide the expertise, and we both benefit. A silent partner. He wanted me to hand over operational control of my inheritance and trust him to manage it properly. The same man who'd driven us into debt multiple times with his poor decision-making now wanted me to believe he was qualified to manage nearly $1 million in real estate. What percentage of the profits are you proposing for yourself? I asked. I was thinking a 70-30 split would be fair, he said casually. 70 for you, 30 for me, plus a base management fee of $800 per month. I did the quick math in my head. Based on his projections, my properties would generate about $5,500 per month in rental income. His 30% share would be another $1,650, plus his base fee. He was proposing to take nearly $2,500 per month, almost half the total income, for managing properties I owned. That seems like a lot, I said carefully. Trevor's smile tightened. Ruth, professional property management typically costs 15 to 20% of rental income. What I'm proposing is actually quite reasonable when you factor in my experience and the additional income I'll generate. But I was already seeing through his manipulation. He was framing this as a generous offer when what he really wanted was to gain control of my assets and extract as much money as possible for himself. I need to think about this, I said, starting to gather up his documents. Trevor's hand shot out to stop me. Ruth, don't overthink this. Opportunities like this don't come along every day. The longer you wait to implement proper management, the more money you're losing. There was an edge to his voice now, a familiar pressure that I recognized from our marriage. This was how it always started, presenting his ideas as urgent necessities that couldn't wait for careful consideration. You said I could take time to think about it, I reminded him. That was before I put together this comprehensive plan, he replied, his tone becoming more aggressive. I've invested considerable time and effort into analyzing your situation. The least you could do is give me a definitive answer. I stood up, suddenly feeling claustrophobic in my own living room. Trevor, I said I need time to think. That's my final answer for tonight. His face darkened with the frustration I remembered all too well. You know what your problem is, Ruth? You've never been able to see the big picture. You get caught up in minor details and miss obvious opportunities. That's why you're a dental hygienist instead of running your own practice. The insult hit exactly where he'd intended, targeting the insecurities he'd spent years cultivating. But instead of the familiar sting of shame, I felt something else rising in my chest. Cold, clear anger. Get out, I said quietly. What? I said get out. Take your condescending attitude and your manipulative business proposal and leave my apartment. Trevor's mouth fell open in shock. Ruth, you're overreacting. I'm trying to help you. You're trying to help yourself, I interrupted, my voice gaining strength. You think I don't see what this really is? You want to take control of my inheritance and use it to benefit yourself, just like you did with everything else during our marriage. That's ridiculous, he sputtered, but his face was flushing red. I'm offering you legitimate business expertise. You're offering to steal my assets legally, I shot back. 70-30 split plus management fees? Full operational authority? Do you think I'm stupid, Trevor? He stood up, his composure finally cracking. Maybe if you'd learned anything about business instead of spending your evenings playing with teeth, you'd understand what a good deal looks like. Maybe if you'd learned anything about honesty instead of spending our marriage scheming for easy money, you'd understand why I don't trust you. We stared at each other across my coffee table, 15 years of resentment and disappointment hanging in the air between us. Finally, Trevor grabbed his folder and headed for the door. You're making a mistake, Ruth, he said, his voice cold. You're going to lose everything because you're too proud to accept help from someone who actually knows what they're doing. We'll see about that, I replied. After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and called Janet. He's not going to give up, I told her, recounting the evening's conversation. He's already drawn up business plans and partnership agreements. He thinks I'm going to fold under pressure. How do you feel about that? Janet asked. I took a sip of wine and considered the question. How did I feel? Angry, certainly. Insulted, definitely. But underneath those emotions was something else. A fierce determination that surprised me with its intensity. I feel like I'm finally ready to fight back, I said. Trevor's been underestimating me for so long that he's forgotten I'm not the same person who let him walk all over me during our marriage. Good, Janet said firmly, because tomorrow we're going to start building your defenses. And Ruth, by the time we're done, Trevor's going to wish he'd never heard about your inheritance. Friday afternoon, I signed the final documents establishing the Patterson Family Trust and Suncaster Property Management, LLC. Howard Brennan had worked quickly, creating an ironclad legal structure that gave me complete control over my inherited properties while protecting them from any outside interference. Your ex-husband has no legal standing to claim any involvement in these assets, Howard explained as I reviewed the paperwork. The trust is revocable only by you, and the LLC requires your signature for any major decisions. Even if he somehow convinced you to enter into a partnership agreement, it would have to be approved by the trust and documented through the LLC. I felt a surge of satisfaction as I signed my name on the final page. For the first time since inheriting the properties, I felt truly secure in my ownership. That evening, Trevor called while I was cooking dinner. Ruth, I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, and I want to apologize for being pushy. Why don't we start over? Maybe I could just consult on a few small decisions, help you get oriented without any formal partnership. I almost laughed at the transparent manipulation. He was backing down from his aggressive approach, trying to get his foot in the door through false humility. Actually, Trevor, I've made some decisions about the properties, I said pleasantly. I've established a property management company and set up all the legal structures I need. I won't be needing your services." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "You did what?" "I hired a lawyer and set up proper business entities to manage my inheritance. Everything's been legally established and documented." "Ruth, you can't just make decisions like that without consulting someone who understands the implications." "I can. And I did," I interrupted. "The properties are protected under a trust, and I'm the sole trustee and beneficiary. There's no role for outside partners or managers." His voice sharpened with frustration. "You're making a serious mistake. You don't have the experience to handle this alone." "I guess we'll find out," I said, and hung up. Trevor's response came faster than I'd expected. The following Tuesday, he showed up at my dental practice during my lunch break, striding into the office with the confidence of someone who thought he still had leverage. "Ruth, we need to talk," he announced, loud enough that Dr. Henderson looked up from his desk with concern. "This is my workplace, Trevor," I said firmly. "Whatever you want to discuss can wait until after hours." "This can't wait. You've made some serious legal errors with those property documents, and I'm trying to save you from a costly mistake." I could feel my coworkers watching the confrontation unfold. Dr. Henderson stood up, clearly ready to intervene if necessary. "Mr. Patterson," he said politely but firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a medical practice, not a place for personal disputes." Trevor's face flushed red. "This is about protecting Ruth's financial future. She's signed documents she doesn't understand." "The documents were prepared by a qualified estate attorney," I said coldly. "Everything is perfectly legal and properly executed." "You think you're so smart," Trevor snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "But you're going to lose everything because you're too stubborn to listen to advice from someone who actually knows what they're doing." Dr. Henderson moved toward the phone. "I'm calling security." Trevor shot me one final glare of frustrated rage before storming out of the office. As the door slammed behind him, I realized I was shaking. Not with fear, but with adrenaline. I'd stood up to him publicly and won. "Ruth, are you all right?" Dr. Henderson asked gently. "I'm perfect," I said, and meant it. Absolutely perfect. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, in control of my own life, and ready for whatever came next. Trevor's attempts to manipulate his way into my inheritance had backfired spectacularly. Within weeks of my rejection, word spread through the local real estate community about his unprofessional pursuit of a client's assets. Kellerman Associates, already concerned about his declining performance, quietly reassigned him to lower-level properties, and eventually let him go when his behavior became a liability. His reputation in Phoenix real estate circles was permanently damaged, and he was forced to take a position with a small property management firm in another state, earning a fraction of his previous salary. His dreams of easy money through my inheritance had cost him his career and his standing in the industry he'd claimed to know so well. 2 years later, I stood in the courtyard of my newest acquisition, a charming duplex in Scottsdale that I'd purchased with profits from my existing properties. Suncaster Property Management had grown into exactly what I'd envisioned, a small but successful business built on fair dealing and genuine care for both properties and tenants. Looking back on that frightening but exhilarating time when Trevor tried to seize control of my inheritance, I realized that his manipulation had given me the greatest gift of all, the final push I needed to discover just how capable I truly was.